Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. AMD Athlon X4 950 4-core 4-thread 3.8 GHz processor, $59. Should you buy one? In this video, we're going to answer that question. I'm also going to compare it to the slightly more expensive Ryzen 3 1200 processor, 4 cores, 4 threads, 3.4 GHz, $110. Yes, you heard me right. It is 400 megahertz slower, same core count, and it's $50 more expensive. Now, rest assured, the Ryzen 3 1200 is faster than the Athlon X4. The question is, how much? Is it worth spending the extra money? And which motherboard, the A320 or the B350, should you consider? We'll cover all that in this video. Benchmarks coming up later, but I'm going to give you the summary up front in case you don't want to watch this entire video. Furthermore, links to everything I'm discussing in this video, the motherboards, the CPUs, will all be down in the video description below to both Amazon and Newegg. If you find this video helpful and useful in your shopping experience, please consider using those links down there and support the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. The X4 950 is an updated version of the previous generation X4 800 series CPUs, which was installed in the FM2 socket in the older, now retired motherboards from AMD. This is an important point because while they've now updated it to work with both DDR4 RAM and the new A320 and B350 chipset motherboards, they didn't actually update the cores. They're still 28nm excavator cores. Now, on my channel, I don't usually talk about things like 28nm versus 14nm and such, but it's an important point in this case because these are both 4-core, 4-thread CPUs. They're both installed in exactly the same motherboard using the same RAM. Yet this 3.8 GHz processor is slower than this 3.4 GHz processor. And to understand that, we have to understand that the Zen cores, the 14nm cores in Ryzen, are substantially improved. They do more work per clock cycle, more work per gigahertz than the old excavator cores do, which is why it's faster and thus AMD charges more for it. If you're looking for more performance, then definitely Ryzen is going to be it. The benefit of this, however, is that it allows you to enter the AM4 platform. It lets you upgrade to a modern motherboard with modern technology at an extreme budget price and then upgrade your CPU in the future. AMD has promised, and they've got a good track record with this, they've promised that the AM4 socket and these motherboards will be good until at least 2020. Their past track record indicates they should be good with that. The AM3 and the FM2 beforehand lasted for many, many years. Unlike Intel, who changes their motherboards every other year and requires you buy a new motherboard, AMD has a good track record of keeping these. So you could buy one of these motherboards and buy a budget processor and use it for a year or two, and then consider upgrading to something faster. Not just the current Ryzen chips, but Zen 2 or Zen 3 cores, which they're working on right now. That is definitely an advantage of the AMD platform, and it does make this CPU at least have some sense for some people. I wouldn't buy the older version anymore. Don't buy one that plugs into an FM2 socket, the 800 series. But the 900 might be worth taking a look at. It is worth noting that Ryzen supports up to DDR4 3200, whereas the X4 950 only supports DDR4 2400. You can, however, install faster RAM. It will simply be forced to run at 2400. I actually had the same DDR4 2666 installed, and it simply ran at 2400 on the X4. Now, neither of these CPUs includes integrated graphics. You will have to install a graphics card with both of them. But if you are interested in an APU with integrated graphics built into the chip, much like the way Intel does, AMD's got you covered with a couple of other side benefits. The Athlon A12 9800. It is $50 more, magically the same price as the Ryzen 3 1200, same 4 cores as the X4 950, but 4.2 gigahertz instead of 3.8, and it is unlocked multiplier. It's got 512 stream processors, it's R7 graphics. It's certainly not going to be as good as an RX 570, but it will give you basic gaming performance for the same price as this, but with graphics included. Now, there's no benchmarks in this video of this processor. It's going to get its own video, and I will show the results of this and some others when I do the review of this, but for now, I just want to mention that this exists if you want basic integrated graphics and an unlocked multiplier. Paired with an aftermarket cooler and overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz, it'll be interesting to see how well this does compared to Ryzen 3 when given a 1 gigahertz advantage, but that's for a future video. All right, enough about the technology and the differences. Let's get down to specific recommendations. Do I think you or anyone else should buy an X4 950? No, I really don't. I rarely review products on my channel that I basically say, no, don't buy this. But I'm here to tell you, no, don't buy this. I put a lot of thought into this, into what scenarios would make any kind of sense for somebody to buy an Athlon X4 950, and the reality is, there aren't any. Not that I can think of anyway. That's what the comments down below are for. By all means, leave your opinion. If you disagree with me, that's fine. But I believe that if you're going to buy a new motherboard, new RAM, and set up either upgrade an older system or set up a new system, by the time you've spent all that money, the $50 price difference between these CPUs makes the Ryzen 3 1200 a much better choice. Overclocked to 3.7 gigahertz on the included stock cooler on an inexpensive B350 motherboard, the Ryzen 3 1200 is up to double the performance of the Athlon X4 950. Not a little bit, I really do mean double. And even in general day-to-day tasks, you're looking at 50 to 70% more performance. For $50, yes, it's almost twice the price for just the CPU, but you aren't just buying a CPU. You need a motherboard, you probably need RAM. If you're going to something like this, you don't have DDR4 already. You may even be building an entire machine. The $50 just doesn't justify it considering the huge performance gap between these chips. Now, I reserve the right to have a slightly different opinion on the A12 9800 that I mentioned before because it includes integrated graphics. Now, the CPU is of course much slower than this, but it's 4.2 gigahertz and it's unlocked overclockable. At 4.7 gigahertz, it might make sense if you don't want to add a graphics card or you just need basic graphics. I'm not convinced that makes sense, but I will test it. I have not tested it yet. But as far as this CPU goes, my advice is to skip it. Now, some people may say, but I just need to upgrade from something older. I just need something, I want to be on the new platform, and this gets me onto AM4, and it gets me 4 modern-ish cores and reasonable performance. Let me offer you a thought to that argument. The 5-plus-year-old i5 3450 Ivy Bridge 3rd generation locked processor from Intel is faster than this, noticeably so. Now, it's not as fast as the Ryzen 3, of course, but it's anywhere between 20 to 40% faster, depending upon what you're doing, than the Athlon X4 950. I would take a 5-year-old i5 used machine before I would take an X4 950. You can find i5 3450s for under $150 on eBay, the complete total machine, case, power supply, Windows license, some RAM, storage. Now, I've done videos on those machines in the past. I will link to those and eBay down below. If you are on an extreme budget, if you've only got a couple $100 and every $50 counts, frankly, go buy an i5 3450 off of eBay. For $150, you can buy a nice machine with 8 gigabytes of RAM and a 500 gig hard drive. If you want to play games on it, you can drop a $100 GTX 1050 into it, or use the integrated graphics. Those i5s come with graphics if you just need something for Windows. I really cannot find any rational reason for this to exist. Even people who just want to be future-proofed. Start with the Ryzen 3 1200. It is such a better processor than this is. It is noticeably better in all respects, even just using Windows, installing web browsers, launching programs, just multitasking. You can feel the difference, even forgetting the benchmarks for a minute. Just using both of these chips, which I did on the same day, I could absolutely pick them out in a double-blind test. It is clear and obvious that the Ryzen CPU is superior to the Athlon X4 950. Sorry, AMD, the Athlon X4 line, frankly, that ship has sailed and it needs to move on because Ryzen is awesome. I am absolutely a fan of the Ryzen chips, and if you're looking for great modern performance, I give Ryzen 2 thumbs up, not the Athlon X4. I will have an upcoming video, as I said before, on the A12 9800. I reserve the right to view that differently. I'm not sure that I will because it has the same basic 4 cores that this does, just clocked a bit higher. But I will put my anti-bias cap on and take a look at it. Now, with all of that being said, remember to like the video, subscribe, comment, check the links down in the description below if this was helpful, And then let's go take a look at some benchmarks so you can see all the numbers behind my conclusions. Our first benchmark today is CPU-Z, single-threaded and multi-threaded. First, let's look at the multi-threaded. At stock speeds, the Ryzen 3 1200 is 80% faster than the X4 950 and 115% faster when you overclock it to 3.7 gigahertz. This is not a small difference. That is incredible, and it's why I don't recommend the X4 950. The single-threaded performance is a little bit closer, but it's still 78% faster when overclocked, single core to single core versus the Athlon X4 950. The next benchmark is Cinebench R15. I'm showing you both the CPU and the OpenGL test. Note, same graphics card in both machines, so no difference there. We are looking at up to 85% more performance on Ryzen 3 in the OpenGL test and 75% more performance on the CPU test. Again, not a minor difference. For $50, again, Ryzen 3. 7-Zip is a file compression decompression utility with a built-in benchmark. It shows both compressing speed, decompressing speed, and then a total number. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the Athlon X4 950, the compressing, decompressing, and total numbers, and then compare those same color bar graph in the center and on the right for the overclock speed. Short version, we're looking at a substantial performance improvement on Ryzen 3. Not quite as much as the previous test I showed you, but we're still looking at over 50% more performance for Ryzen than we are on the Athlon X4. This next test, PCMark 10, is definitely worth running on your own machine if you want to compare it to these. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes to run, but it's a free download. Go check it out. Now, the benefit to this test is it tests the entire system, not just the CPU. Things like CPU-Z and Cinebench are only testing the CPU. This tests storage, the graphics card, memory performance. I would like to point out that both of these CPUs were installed on the exact same motherboard with the same memory, with the same graphics card, although granted it's DDR4 2400 on the X4. We have over 50% more performance clock for clock Ryzen 3 versus Athlon X4. Furthermore, just as I said before, using the machine, the Ryzen is much more responsive, opening web browsers, downloading, installing programs. Just using the machine on a day-to-day basis, there is a noticeable performance improvement. I don't make a not recommended comment lightly. This right here, day-to-day use taking the entire machine into account, this shows that there really is a major performance difference between Ryzen, either stock or overclocked, compared to the X4. 3DMark is a 3D graphics benchmark, primarily graphics card limited. In fact, the only test here is the purple one at 1080p, showing the limitation at higher resolutions of our GTX 1070. There is a 47% performance improvement between the X4 950 and the Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked at 1080p, showing that the Ryzen 3 has much more headroom for higher frame rates and better graphics and gaming performance when given enough graphics card. This group 2 is older test in 3DMark, Skydiver, Cloudgate, and Ice Storm Extreme. The Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked is 90% faster in the Ice Storm Extreme test and about 70 to 80% faster in the other two. It is a huge difference, and it just goes to show that when you're running CPU-bound tests, CPU-bound games, the Ryzen 3 really is faster. On, say, Firestrike 4K, of course there's no difference because we're totally graphics card limited, but once you give each machine a decent graphics card, clearly the Ryzen 3 is the winner. This is VRMark, similar results. The orange room is CPU bound as much as it is GPU bound. The blue room is a future test, and it just shows that neither of these are capable of running that. That score is way below expectations. But we are looking at more than 70% faster performance in the orange room current VR games on the Ryzen 3. You absolutely can play VR games, an HTC Vive or Oculus Rift, on a Ryzen 3 processor with an appropriate graphics card. Even a GTX 1060 would be enough for VR gaming. The X4 950, no, it falls below the minimum frame rates required because the CPU simply can't keep up with it. The Unigine series of benchmarks are 3 different benchmarks from 3 different eras showing the frame rate and a score I'll show you in a second in Heaven, Valley, and Superposition. This is a great way of showing that older games run fine on any of these CPUs. Heaven is pretty close, but that's because it came out in 2009. It's an 8-year-old benchmark. Superposition is a much newer benchmark. Notice the 40% performance increase? That's because more recent games, more recent programs are much more demanding. And the only reason the increase isn't larger is because we're graphics card limited. Notice that stock and overclocked and superposition is exactly the same. That's because the GTX 1070 was actually the limitation and bottleneck there, not the CPU. The score is a bit different. You can see here again superposition between the stock and overclocked on the Ryzen 3 was about the same. Look how much lower the performance is on the X4 950. Again, it's just not up for modern games, modern 3D applications. But even the older Valley test, you can see a big difference between even a stock Ryzen 3. It's nearly twice as fast than the Athlon X4 950. That brings us to the game benchmarks, all 1080p, all high detail preset, Rise of the Tomb Raider. If you look at the averages, we got 75 frames per second average on the X4 950, perfectly playable and great, right? Well, not really. The minimum was down at 28 frames per second. It was extremely choppy. Certainly, there are places in the game that would function fine on that CPU. And places that wouldn't. It would be a very uneven experience. The only reason it's up at 75 is because we have a complete overkill graphics card installed. The Ryzen 3 1200 shows what a better CPU does. Look at the minimum of 47. But look at the improvement when we overclock the Ryzen 3 to 3.7 gigahertz, we get 66 frames per second minimum. That is not a small change, and it just goes to show the value in both a modern processor and a high clock speed, because we're still running about the same clock speed there, but we go from 28 minimum to 66 minimum, going from an X4 950 to a Ryzen 3 1200. Same result here on Mankind Divided, 26 frames per second minimum. In fact, the 41 is way below 60 in terms of average on the X4, but we're at 69 and 75 average and 49 and 54 minimum on the Ryzen 3. There's no contest. Our graphics card is completely being held back by the X4 950. If you've watched this far in the video, this should come as no surprise whatsoever. 56 frames per second average in GTA 5 on the X4 950, 87 and 97 frames per second average on the Ryzen 3 stock and overclock respectively. Minimums likewise very close to 60 frames a second on the Ryzen 3, in fact just over when it's overclocked, versus 33 frames per second. This is nearly double the frame rate between an overclocked Ryzen 3 at 3.7 and the X4 950. Now, I will absolutely be the first person to say that a GTX 1070 is extreme overkill for either of these CPUs. You should absolutely not pair any of these CPUs with a GTX 1070. That's not why it's here. You can see the Farcry Primal numbers here, same thing as before. The purpose of the GTX 1070 is to lift the GPU restrictions. If I put a 1050 Ti or an RX 570 in here, all we do is be GPU bound and be held back by the graphics card. Modern games really need more performance than that. For 1080p gaming, the 1070 is really becoming a go-to card. A 1060 will still do it, but the 1060 and the 1070 are now a year old. And as we move into 2018, I think the 1070 is going to become the new 1080p gaming card, as these results clearly show. Now we've moved into the For Honor results. Again, no big surprises here. About a 50% improvement in the averages and about, actually more than a 50% improvement in the minimums between the stock and the overclocked Ryzen 3. Notice a trend yet? Yeah, pretty much. It's the same thing across the board. Next, we have the Division, where the results are not as dramatic as the previous tests. This is one of the closer benchmark results. Still a decent jump in performance. This is an outlier. This is one of those results that people point to when they say, oh, what are you talking about? My older CPU or my budget $50 CPU, it runs games just fine. 84 frames per second average, 47 frames per second minimum on the Division 1080p high detail. You're completely correct. That actually is playable. But it's the exception that proves the rule. That is why there are 25 benchmarks here, because 1 or 2 are going to show that it's fine, and then all the others are going to show that it's not. Here we are with Ghost Recon Wildlands. We're back to the huge dramatic differences again, nearly double the frame rate between the overclocked Ryzen 3 and the stock X4 950. Now, if you're looking at the titles that I'm testing here, you might be saying, wait a minute, these are all AAA games. Don't people use these CPUs for esports titles, League of Legends, Counter-Strike Global Offensive? Sure. But an i5-2400 will play those games. You don't need any new CPU for that. If your whole goal is to play League of Legends, why are you getting a new computer? Go on eBay, spend $150, get an i5-2400 or 3450, and be very happy and spend a lot less money than a new computer. And our final test is Rainbow Six Siege, a game that is actually completely playable on an Athlon X4 950, but it certainly has a higher frame rate on the Ryzen 3. Certainly this is sort of a hybrid game. It's half esports, half not. It's playable on a wide variety of cards and computers. Granted, all of these numbers would be lower if we had less of a graphics card in here, and it really is playable on, say, a GTX 1060 3GB card on the X4 950, but it is smoother and better with minimums well above 60 frames per second, even on a stock clocked Ryzen 3. Well, there you have it. 25 benchmark results showing you the performance difference between the Ryzen 3 1200 stock and overclocked versus the Athlon X4 950. As I said before, there's too much performance difference for the price. This simply has too many limitations, in my opinion, in 2017 to justify a new motherboard and a new platform. Skip it, spend the $50. It's worth every penny. And frankly, if you just can't afford the Ryzen 3 1200, that's fine. I understand. The older i5s that you can find on eBay are incredible values for the money. If you need a budget machine, that's where I would go. I own several. I still use them. Even with all this wonderful hardware that I have, they're great computers, and I highly recommend them if you're on a budget or simply need a budget cheap second or third machine for a home theater PC or just casual use. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and please use those links in the video description. It really does make a difference. The links to Amazon, Newegg, and eBay are all affiliate links. They all support the channel. Thank you very much. You will also find links to my Twitter, Twitch, and Patreon accounts down there. If you can support the channel directly, that would also help very much. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next video.